Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Walter Russell Mead is with us. Walter is one of our leading and most influential foreign policy thinkers. He has written 5 published books on American foreign relations, the latest of which carries the sizzling title of The Ark of a Covenant: The United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People. He is a professor at Bard College, the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and I can tell you, to paraphrase the old E.F. Hutton slogan, when Mead talks about American foreign policy, everyone listens. I'm really thrilled to welcome Walter Russell Mead to the program.
It is great to be here. Just thank you for having me.
Well, congratulations on many fronts, but congratulations on your book, and congratulations that the New York Times has selected your book as one of the 100 notable books of 2022. And in the same group as poetry, fiction, memoirs, and there you are, Fate of the Jewish People, The Ark of a Covenant.
There you go. I once had an intern who told me, Jews are news.
Well, that may be so. When you think of foreign policy now, you think immediately of Ukraine and China and Russia and Iran. Israel is kind of on a back burner these days. It's almost boring. Now your book comes out. But why did you decide to write this book?
Well, because there's a line in the book where I say, Israel occupies a speck on the map of the world, but a continent in the American mind. And if you want to understand how Americans think about foreign policy generally, and kind of how public opinion and strategic interests in politics shape our foreign policy, it turns out that studying this little country and our relationship to it opens a lot of doors.
Well, let's start with American Jews, because everyone seems to blame Israel on American Jews. It's a trope. Everyone seems to blame our foreign policy on the Jewish lobby or American Jews. Kennedy would from time to time speak of the Jews as kind of the focus of an Irish politician. Someone named David Chappelle, a comedian on Saturday Night Live, took some heat because he talked about the Jews running Hollywood. Now, are the Jews a team like the Carolina Panthers, that they have a sense of shared purpose?
Right. Maybe like the Carolina Panthers in a really bad year. But there are rumors out there that Jews have a lot of different opinions and points of view. And
well, that accounts for their unfortunate history.
Right. Well, I did at one point, I kind of half-jokingly suggested to the publisher that the subtitle should be, Don't Blame Israel on the Jews. Because in fact, actually America has been less central to the story of Israel and its rise than most Americans think. And American Jews were less central in American policymaking toward Israel. Just to give you an example of how oddly it all works, the most important single thing that the U.S. ever did to promote the creation of the State of Israel was when we blocked immigration from Europe in 1924. That overnight closed the door on hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants who were coming in at that point. And prior to that time, of the millions of Jews who left Europe and especially Russia, over 90% came to the United States. Most of the rest went to other countries like Canada or Australia. Argentina, and a very small percentage went to Palestine. Palestine was malarial. There were lots of people there who were trying to kill you. It was not a favorite spot.
The land was arid.
Yeah, exactly. No, it was. There was really, and many of the Zionist pioneers who went there left because it was so inhospitable. But in the 1920s and 30s, one by one, the countries that Jews could go to closed their doors. And Palestine by the 1930s, as advocates could say, it's the only place on earth that wants Jews. So had the U.S. not blocked immigration, there likely would never have been enough Jews in Palestine to form a state. And again, far from the American Jewish lobby engineering this as a way to get a state of Israel, American Jewish lobby was pretty strongly, unanimously against immigration restrictions. On the other hand, at roughly the same time,
Immigration to the United States.
yeah, immigration to the United States. They wanted to keep the door open for Jewish immigration and other immigration. At the same time, Congress was debating whether the U.S. should endorse the Balfour Declaration, Britain's decision to build allow the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine on captured Ottoman land after World War I. And American Jewish community was actually bitterly divided over this. And the leadership of the American Jewish community and the most politically influential and the wealthiest American Jews were absolutely against the Balfour Declaration and against the whole Zionist project. Henry Morgenthau, the first, who had been Wilson's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire and was the senior political figure among American Jews of the day and very wealthy guy, organized, I think, 400 leading American Jews to sign a petition not to accept the Balfour Declaration.
But now we're talking about, what, 1914?
Well, this is actually 1920s, early 1920s.
But we're backing up. But that wasn't the beginning of American Zionism. We had something called the Blackstone Memorial in 1891. Maybe you should talk about that.
No, while American Jews are really don't like the idea of Zionism. In fact, the New York Times in the 19th century, when it was owned by Christians, was pro-Zionist. Jews bought the New York Times. It became anti-Zionist. It's an interesting flip.
It's true of the Washington Post as well.
Yeah, in Vienna, Herzl's own newspaper would not use the word Zionism until it was in his obituary.
Herzl was the founder
of Zionism, the Austrian Jewish founder of Zionism. Yeah, so 2 years before Herzl wrote his book, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, which is kind of the charter of the modern Zionist movement among West European Jews, 2 years before then, President Benjamin Harrison is sitting peacefully in the White House, not bothering anybody, when the Secretary of State comes in and hands him a petition asking him to help establish a Jewish state, use America's diplomatic influence and so on to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. This petition is signed by John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, a galaxy of journalistic, intellectual, religious, and political leaders of kind of the Anglo-WASP establishment of the East Coast and the Middle West. Jews were conspicuous by their absence from this declaration. So Zionism, the idea that there should be a Jewish state, was solidly implanted in the American establishment before the Zionist movement existed among European Jews.
Let's go back to the founding of the Republic. There were Jews present in the United States in 1776 and before. George Washington had some ideas about the American Jewish community. Maybe you can go into that.
Yeah, this is again one of the astonishing things is that there's always been anti-Semitism in America, and what we've seen recently at Mar-a-Lago and some of the craziness that's going on is not a new phenomenon. We can talk about that if you want to, but at the same time, there's been this strong counter movement of a kind of an instinctive revulsion at anti-Semitism. And Jews in America from colonial times felt that America was a better place for them to live than any of the European countries. You have Jews there weren't very many. There were only about 1,000 in the U.S. at the time of the Revolution. but they were accepted. They were often Sephardic Jews. Many of them had fled Brazil when the Portuguese reconquered it from the Dutch in the 17th, 18th century, including the ones who came as refugees to New York that Peter Stuyvesant tried to get rid of. And they were very well integrated into the community and kind of accepted. They served on juries in some cases. But there was still a question. The revolution comes. What is the attitude of the new country toward Jews going to be? And in Truro, there was actually some talk of trying to get all the Jews in America to write a letter to George Washington. But again, the Jews did not agree. There were 6 synagogues in America, and they really could not get together on a program. But the synagogue in Newport, Truro, sent a letter asking Washington.
This is Rhode Island.
Yeah. So what's the situation going to be? And Washington says basically, in this country, we no longer speak of toleration, as if some Americans didn't have the same right to be here. Everybody who obeys the law has a perfect right to be here, live, work, vote, do their own thing under their own vine and their own fig tree, and said this is not just my personal view. This is the nature of our institutions, and that. Interesting, that document was really not controversial at the time. This was how people felt. So there was this attitude toward Jews in America right from the beginning that, to the present day, in 2,500 years, I don't think you could find another country, another society where the diasporic Jews have had the same kind of ease of opportunity, of access, of integration that they have enjoyed in the United States, especially really in the last 2 generations.
So in America, we've had kind of a cross current of feeling, haven't we? We've had those that believe that the Jews should be fully, here I go with the Jews again, integrated into American life and culture, as undoubtedly they became entrenched, in those that feel that somehow or other there's something foreign about them,
right?
Something different about them, and something that should be uprooted. And then layering on top of that is this notion of a Jewish homeland, which didn't even start with George Washington. It started before that in America with Cotton Mather.
I know. In the 17th century in Boston, these Puritan clergy are writing books that say, and the Bible tells us that sometime in the future, incredible as it may sound, impossible, God will call the scattered Jews of the earth back to the lands of the Bible. And this was generally speaking kind of Puritan English Reformation. You get a lot of this. John Milton wrote about it. Sir Isaac Newton wrote about it. But it took a particularly strong hold in the U.S. And it continues as a theological train of thought right on through. And it's not a fundamentalist thing or an evangelical thing. It's something that you find well, certainly, Rockefeller was no fundamentalist, John D. Rockefeller. For many Americans, there was this idea that you look at the ancient world and you see these 3 great peoples, the Greeks, the Hebrews, the Romans. And you read their literature and it's full of heroes. They live in republics. They are virtuous. The land is beautiful. The people are prosperous. The men are brave and the women are good looking, or maybe vice versa, but it's just terrific. And you look at them now. By now, I mean, say the early 19th century. The Greeks are under the Turks and Greece is miserable and poor. The Romans are under the popes and the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, and Italy is a malarial sinkhole, and unspeakably poor and the people are superstitious, and no one is really talking about the Italians as models of courage and honesty the way the ancient Romans were. And then you look at the Jews, again, scattered through the earth. Palestine, when Mark Twain visited, he said, it's the worst thing I've seen since Arizona. And this sense of the people is in ruins and the land is in ruins. But not just for the Jews, for the Greeks and the Romans too. And Americans at this time had this maybe crazy idea that if these people would adapt American ideas, that the American ideals, self-government, honest hard work on the farm, equality, get rid of the power of superstitious states and separate church and state. You did all these things, then you would flourish. So when the Greeks rise up against the Ottoman Turks, Americans, including Julia Ward Howe's future husband, go to Greece to fight for Greek freedom. And there's a huge vogue, fashion for the Greek freedom fighters. It's kind of like Ukraine today or something. Same thing with Italy. They actually offered Garibaldi a job as a general in the American Civil War, but people were so excited by the Italian Risorgimento, and they thought, okay, this can happen to the Jews too.
If only they take up farming.
Exactly.
So you have Henry Ford, who a notorious anti-Semite, who undoubtedly did not sign the Blackstone Memorial. But Henry Ford said, show me a Jewish farmer.
Yeah.
And then Zionism showed him a Jewish farmer.
Well, actually, you can go to Jerusalem today and stay in the American Colony Hotel, which was originally found. Americans went over to Jerusalem to try to persuade the Jews to farm, I think 1860s, 70s. And, drag them out into the hot sun. Say, I don't want to be out here in the hot sun. I don't want to work on a farm. And the colony did not succeed, but it left a very nice hotel in its wake. But yeah, so when you start getting the kibbutzes in Israel, you start getting the farmers.
Captures the imagination.
Well, and also the Americans aren't saying, oh, those Jews, they're now going to try to impose their agenda on us. They're saying, finally, the Jews have figured out what we've been telling them all along. The Jews are getting with the program. So there was a tremendous sense of vindication that a lot of Americans had. And then as obviously it kind of worked, and so the Jews are, these farms are, the land is blooming and the people are blooming, and then this despised group of people who everyone thinks is weak and no good, they're standing up for themselves and gaining respect. You see, for a lot of Americans, that was a sign American ideas work. Even the Jews, if they buy into the American way of life, will be magnificent, free, strong people.
I'm reminded of that photograph of the couple tilling the soil on the kibbutz, and the husband has his hand plow, and I don't know, maybe he's on a tractor, and the wife is following him, and she has a rifle.
Yeah.
Over her shoulder.
Well, a lot of Americans saw that and felt pretty good. But I think there's another level without which it's hard to understand the kind of American emotional attachment to Israel. Not that everybody feels it or feels it equally, but people will tell you who's pro-Israel. Oh, it's the white evangelicals and the Jews. But if you look at the polls, about 12 to 14% of America are white evangelicals. Black, Hispanic evangelicals, a bit more. And then about 2% are Jews. Well, 12 plus 2 is 14%. That's not, you look at polls, how many people are sympathetic for Israel, you get 3 and 4 and even 5 times that number. So that's not where it all is.
So is there a Christian Zionist element that is part of all this?
Well, there has
its origins in the Bible.
There is, but there's a hard Christian Zionism which is linked to very specific theological interpretations. But there's a soft Christian Zionism, and maybe the best way to describe this is think about the situation of people in the mid-late 1940s. 1944, Soviet troops break into Poland and they start liberating the camps. And you see, you know, there'd been stories about the Holocaust, there was knowledge, but now you're seeing, you know, newsreel footage, and you're seeing pictures, and you're hearing from survivors. And what this is telling you, you know, in a civilization that kind of thought that the Enlightenment was putting us all on a new path, that science and technology and culture were going to cure the dark stain inside human nature. And so we would be better people because of the Enlightenment. And that's our faith in progress, is we're morally better than our ancestors. Well, Germany was the most enlightened country, you know, Goethe, Schiller, Hegel, the philosophy, the music, and, you know, this society produces, you know, a crime that would have shocked Attila the Hun. And your faith in the human nature and the possibility of a kind of good society really takes a knock. The next year, 45, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so this unreformed, bestial animal capable of the most unbelievable crimes and of the greatest stupidities now has the power to wipe out all life on earth.
Let's just talk for a moment about this transformation of Israel, because you talk about Israel in the 1940s and the 1950s. That's the kibbutz, and that's
right.
the ideals, and that's the fulfillment of the biblical promise, the
right,
land
right.
of milk and honey. And then you find Israel today armed to the teeth, independent of the United States, paying more or less their fair share of their defense and security, developed a nuclear bomb, and strutting and fretting their hour upon the stage.
Right.
Netanyahu is back, and now there's a whole strain of American political thought that finds this quite appealing. They like the iron fist. And
right.
You talked about Hiroshima,
right.
Colin Powell, devastating force is the only way to wage war. And
right, no, very much.
So things have changed greatly, haven't they?
Yeah, but again, we start with this moment, 1948, Israel appears. And it's like, okay, we have Hiroshima, we have, you know, the Holocaust, and now here's Israel. It's a sign, you know, just like the preacher told me when I was a kid, that someday the Jews would return. It was a sign to a lot of people. This is the soft Christian Zionism, that somehow the big guy upstairs is still in charge. That in this chaotic history, communism, Nazism, nuclear weapons, there's still something, there is a there's a guide, there's a force. That, I think, becomes, and people like Billy Graham in their preaching really highlight, we're at the end of the world and Israel is here. Not again with some specific, like, you know, rapture or these sorts of specific scenarios of the end, but just to capture this sense. Now, with Israel, as you say, strong and powerful, it's created this odd thing. In the 1950s, when Israel was weak, it was the darling of the left. And people younger than you and me don't necessarily remember this. But in the 1950s, Israel was a great left-wing cause. The Democratic Socialists of America used to identify Israel as the poster child for socialism because, you know, everybody say, well, you know, socialism, no one will be free. They say, look at Israel, which was far more socialist in the 50s than any of the West European social democracies. And they've got free elections. And they say, well, but socialism can't build a strong economy. Well, look at Israel. They're taking in all these immigrants and refugees, and they have a strong national defense. Socialism works.
Until it didn't.
Well, and then, you know, and that broke a lot of hearts, I think, when the Israelis moved to the right in the 1970s.
Okay, well, sadly, we've run out of time because this has been a delightful and fascinating discussion. But we can talk about preachers from Cotton Mather to Malcolm X. But I have a question for you, Walter Russell Mead, and my question is, should we blame Israel on the Jews?
obviously, this, they once asked Robert E. Lee, or he heard some people arguing about, why the South lost the Civil War. And we said, well, it was the tariffs and it was the factories and all this. And Lee says, I always thought the Yankees had something to do with it. So I am going to say that I think, the Zionists had a lot to do with it. Without the Zionists, there would be no state of Israel. But the Zionists did not sort of say, we're going to mobilize the secret Jewish power that rules the world and will force them to give us a state.
That runs Hollywood.
Right. Runs Hollywood, runs the banks. And
the State Department.
Right. State Department, the Jews had very little success. One weird thing is the U.S. has actually spent more money and more diplomatic capital to build a Palestinian state than it ever did to build a Jewish state. That if you compare U.S. attitudes toward the Palestinian national movement after 48 and the Zionist movement before 48, you should be asking, who's the Palestinian lobby if you want to have conspiracy theories in American politics?
So can we blame Palestinians on the Arabs? But in any event, that's another subject for another
time. That's a whole other subject. But
so I have to thank you for coming by, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. Meanwhile, take care, be well, and all the best.